Hello again, class. This is Professor G once more. And today we are going to begin a discussion on what I believe are two of America's most basic or fundamental institutions, two ideas, two subjects that run throughout American history and that have a very deep impact on the course of American history and in American culture in general. Those two things are, I believe, first of all, American slavery, the particular brand of slavery that becomes evident in the United States, and also American religion, specifically speaking, American Protestantism. So what we're going to be talking about for this lecture is American slavery and the distinctive form of slavery that emerges in America, that emerges in the new budding nation. So when dealing with the issue of American slavery, we come up to a very controversial point, a very interesting point, historically speaking. And so this point deals with how and why American slavery is the way it is. Namely, why does American slavery become racialized? Why do when we talk about American slavery, when I say American slavery, you immediately know that I'm talking about the enslavement of African Americans? How does this happen, historically speaking? Why does American slavery, unlike other forms of slavery throughout the entirety of world history, why does American slavery become focused on African Americans? And what makes this form of slavery distinctive is its brutality, is the intentional subjugation of a specific group of people. And this is a type of slavery that is unheard of in world history. So throughout history, no matter what historical time period you're looking at, no matter what civilization you're looking at or what culture you're looking at, slavery's always been there in one form or another. No matter if we look at the ancient Indians or the ancient Chinese or the ancient Europeans, slavery's pretty much been a constant of human history. Typically speaking, though, when we talk about slavery, what we mean is a form of indentured servitude. Slaves could be somebody who's gone into debt, somebody who owes somebody else a significant portion of money, so they would go into slavery under that person. But that person would only own them or would only control that individual until their debt was paid off. And typically speaking, in most societies, this meant that the person was just working for them without pay. This is what is usually meant by slavery. Also, the slave trade is something that is global, something in history, historically speaking, is something that happened across the globe. The Europeans had a slave trade, the Africans had a slave trade, the Chinese, the Indians, whatever. In fact, one of the largest slave trades, something that we've only recently started to discover, one of the largest slave trades isn't even the African slave trade. It's the slave trade that occurs throughout the Middle Ages along the Silk Road. It's the trading of Europeans to Middle Eastern, specifically the trading of trading from Christian European nations to Muslim nations. There was a massive slave trade, particularly brought about by people such as the Vikings and other groups of Europeans who would sell particularly Eastern Europeans to the Muslim world, to the Ottoman Empire, for example. And this was a massive, massive undertaking. And we see something similar happen with the Atlantic slave trade. But when I say American slavery, the reason why I denote specifically American slavery is because it evolves into something much more distinct. Again, American slavery is distinctive for two principal reasons. First of all, American slavery is racial slavery. American slavery targets specifically Africans. The Atlantic slave trade is the slave trade from West Africa to the Americas, to the Caribbean, to South America, and especially to North America. So American slavery is based along racial lines. First of all, we'll talk about why that is. Second of all, American slavery is distinctive in its brutality. It's distinctive in its brutality. What do I mean by that? This is often hard to talk about for a few reasons. The first reason is that we become so desensitized to violence, especially in our culture today. So when I show you pictures like this of a slave who's been beaten so bad that the scar tissue buildup has formed these distinctive lines all across his back, you've probably seen worse, whether it's through YouTube videos or live link videos of the beheadings in the Middle East, or whether it's just through popular media. You've seen worse. So there's a desensitization. We as a nation have become desensitized to violence, for good or ill. And so when I talk about American slavery being brutal, it's kind of almost a moot point to most people, because we're so used to this level of brutality in our modern world, especially after in the 20th century, after World War I and World War II. This sort of violence is almost natural to us. However, not only is American slavery brutal, but the level of violence and the type of violence, what you don't get from pictures, and oftentimes what you don't get from regular history lessons, is that oftentimes this violence is it's unnecessary, it's meaningless violence. Slave masters, as we'll talk about why throughout this lecture, but slave masters would exhibit this sort of violence on their slaves, not just because the slaves did something they didn't like, but in order to instill a sort of fear, in order to literally beat them into submission. So it's violence, and it's also unjustified, uncalled for violence. It's violence that's perpetuated on a distinct population for no other reason than we want to make sure that they're kept in check. So the two reasons American slavery is different, and two reasons why it's distinctive, historically speaking, is that it's racial slavery and because of its brutality. I'm going to do my best to explain why. And so the big historical question that we're dealing with in this lecture is, how did this happen? And how and why did this happen? Why are African slaves specifically, why are African slaves chosen? Because there's other types of slaves in the world at this time. They could have chose from Chinese slaves or Eastern Asian slaves, or even they could have relied on European indentured servants as they tried initially. So why is it that slavery becomes situated just on Africans? And also, why is it that American slavery is especially brutal? Now, these questions don't just have a historical impact, but they also carry important implications for our modern world. There's a reason why African Americans are in the social position that they are today. There's a reason why, economically speaking, African Americans are still within the poorest bracket of individuals in our country. There's a reason why African Americans didn't get the right to vote, didn't get the same basic citizen rights that we all enjoy until the late 20th century. And all of these reasons can be traced back to American slavery. It is something that sticks with American history, even after slavery has ended in the late 19th century during the Civil War. The impact of slavery, the wake created by slavery is still being felt today because of this. So the years 1450 to 1750 brought enormous changes in the North American continent, especially in the North American economy and how the colonies were going to make money for the British Empire. European explorers not only ventured into the lands and the natural wealth of America, they also traveled to Africa, where they began the transatlantic slave trade, which would bring millions of Africans as well as hundreds of thousands of Europeans to North America. The slave trade would over time lead to a new social and economic system, one where a system in which the color of one's skin could determine whether he or she might live as a free citizen or be enslaved for life. Not only was slavery lifelong for American slaves, but it also was for their children. If you were born into slavery, you would be a slave for the rest of your life. And your children would be slaves for the rest of their lives. Okay, so let's back up and try to explain how this came to be. The history of the European seaborne slave trade with Africa goes back about 50 years, roughly speaking. 50 years prior to the arrival of Columbus in the New World. So we're talking the beginning of the 15th century, the beginning of the 1400s. If you remember from our previous lectures about European colonization, Africa is the place that Europeans begin to explore first, beginning with the Portuguese. And if you can remember why this is the case, this is due in large part to the desire of the Europeans to reach Asian markets. We talked about the importance of the spice trade, the importance of the drug trade, especially the importance of the trading of opium. So Europeans were trying to reach specifically Indian markets and Chinese markets. Now they could do this by land, but the land route required would go straight through the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were oftentimes willing to trade with the Europeans, but of course the Europeans wanted to cut out the middleman. They wanted to make more money. They wanted direct access to these markets. They didn't want to have to share the wealth with the Ottomans. So as a result of this, European nation, beginning with the Portuguese and followed by the Spanish, turned to the sea, looking for new sea routes to reach these Asian markets. Now, they didn't want to just to sell west of Europe. The reason being is because they believed that based on the technology that they have, we talked about the myth that's perpetuated by our modern culture that these people believed that the earth was flat, so they didn't sell west because they believed that they would fall off the end of the earth. All right? We talked about how no one really believed that. The reason why they didn't sell west is because they believed that they wouldn't be able to reach Asia, that the ship wouldn't be able to reach Asia before the crew starved to death, before the crew ran out of supplies. So they were seeking a new way to Asia, and the most logical route for that would be to try to sell around Africa. And this is precisely what they start to do at the beginning of the 15th century, beginning with the Portuguese. Portuguese went into West Africa, along the coast of West Africa, in order to establish trading posts, in order to establish outlets where they could resupply their ships. But again, they're establishing trading posts not just for the sake of establishing posts, but also they wanted to make some money off of this venture. And once they started to establish themselves in Africa, they quickly realized that Africa itself is a very rich source of raw materials, especially a source of gold. So the Portuguese begin to expand into West Africa in search of gold. The purpose of the exploration to expand European geographic knowledge in order to obtain new sea routes, also to find the source of this prized African gold, and to locate the way to reach the Asian markets, a safe way to reach the Asian markets. In 1441, for the first time, Portuguese sailors obtained some gold dust from an African tribe which they were trading with. In the following year, they returned to Africa in order to set up a trading post. They trade with the Africans, but also in 1442, the Portuguese sailors returned for the first time with a new sort of cargo, that being the cargo of African slaves. Again, the slaves that they brought back, the type of slavery that the Europeans were using at this time isn't the level of slavery that the Americans will be using, or that the same European powers will be using in the Americas. We haven't got to that point yet. So the slaves they brought back are essentially indentured servants, and they're brought back specifically for the novelty of it. 40 years after the first human cargo traveled to Portugal, Portuguese sailors gained permission from local African leaders to build trading posts and storehouses on the West African coastline, all along the West African coast. Again, there's also the misconception that these Portuguese are simply landing in Africa and taking whoever they pleased on board their ships, or they just get there and say, all right, we need some slaves, so they go and round up some local people, then take them off. The Portuguese aren't that strong. Okay, these African nations that the Portuguese encountered are well established and well equipped, militarily speaking. I mean, they don't have guns, but they vastly outnumber the Portuguese. So it's not like the Portuguese themselves are coming to Africa, setting up trade posts, and then forcefully taking slaves. They're not doing that. They're trading these tribes for slaves. Typically what they would be trading are specific European goods, such as quality metalwork, quality weapons, especially firearms, and also the typical stuff of cloths, food. The Africans would be trading gold, ivory, and slaves. So the Europeans are trading for slaves. These slaves are being caught. How slaves are always caught throughout history, and this is typically as a result of warfare. Usually speaking, what would happen is one tribe would go to war with another. The men who would be captured during those battles, who would be captured as a result of those wars, were slaves. And so the tribes selling these slaves didn't feel any sort of moral obligation towards these people, because these were conquered people. And so they would willingly sell off these conquered people. Just a way for them to make money. The Africans were either captured with warring raids, as I talked about before. Eventually what starts to happen, though, as the demand for slavery increases, you see an increase in kidnapping. Kidnapping on behalf of the tribes that are selling them, because they realize how much money they can make off of these slaves. So what was once the result of mutual warfare now becomes more akin to kidnapping on behalf of the tribes selling to the Europeans. Again, the slaves are exchanged for iron, gunpowder, mirrors, knives, cloths, all this other good stuff. As the demand for slaves increased, we see a shift in the African market, a shift to focus primarily on the slave trade and nothing else. William de la Palma says this. Palma's a primary source who's watching the increase in the slave trade for himself. He has this to say. I think I have the quote up here. Okay, before I get to Palma's quote, so this is a geographical depiction of what's happened. As you can see, the slaves are coming primarily from the west coast of Africa. This is the area, the Portuguese are coming from this region here. The area that they first reached, the area that they first established these colonies on, is the west coast. Places like Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, central to West Africa here. These are the first places the Portuguese settled down on, and as a result, this is going to be the primary location of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, going from West Africa To begin with, going from West Africa to the Caribbean, or sometimes parts of South America. So to begin with, going to the Caribbean, but as time goes on, as you can see from this map here, most of the slaves, a bulk of the slaves, are going to be heading to North America, specifically to the English colonies that have developed in North America. And there's a good reason for this, because as we'll talk about, and as we've talked about before, think back to the reason why, or think back to how the British colonies in particular are making money. The Spanish who are inhabiting, the Spanish and the Portuguese who have control of South America, the Spanish on the western end, the Portuguese in modern day Brazil. The Spanish and the Portuguese are gaining a large portion of their wealth from the silver and the gold that is being taken from the Incan and the Aztec empires. Basically, the Spanish and the Portuguese show up, and there's just all this gold that these tribes have access to. Well, that's not the case in North America. Remember, we talked briefly about this. The English, when they established their colonies along the North American coastline, it's not like they can just go out and start picking up handfuls of gold like the Spanish and the Portuguese were able to. So they have to find different ways to make money. In the English colonies, this way to make money comes in the forms of crops, comes in the forms of agriculture. So the reason why most of these slaves are being shipped to the Caribbean and to North America has to do with the fact that these economies are centered on and around agriculture. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. So William de la Palma has this to say about the increasing slave trade in Africa, because he's watching this firsthand. Concerning the trade on this coast, we notified your highness that nowadays the natives no longer occupy themselves with the search for gold. So remember, when the Portuguese first get there, the primary trading items are gold and ivory. So de la Palma says that they no longer occupy themselves with the search for gold, but rather make war on each other in order to furnish slaves. The Gold Coast has changed into a complete slave coast. So it's known as the Gold Coast of Africa because the primary trading good was at first gold. But once these African tribes realize the economic demand for slaves that is coming from these European countries, they quickly shift to, instead of supplying gold, now their primary economic means, the primary thing that they're making money off of is slaves. So war increases on the continent of Africa because these tribes are trying to capture as many slaves as possible in order to make the most money as they possibly can. Now, when the Europeans arrive along the west coast, slavery already existed on the continent, as it has everywhere else in the world. However, as a historian, Basil Davison, points out, the slavery in Africa and the brutal form of slavery that would eventually develop in the Americas was vastly different. Again, when I say that these tribes are enslaving other tribes, I'm not talking about the type of slavery that exists in America. Again, we're talking about sort of indentured servitude. First of all, it's only men that are being enslaved. To begin with, it's only men. Why? Because it's only the men who are fighting. You're still free to have your family. You're still free to do as you please in your free time, but you're a slave working for another country. Your labor is free. For example, in the Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa, slaves could marry, they could own property, and slaves could even own other slaves. They had, had quite a deal of economic freedom in that regard. Furthermore, the slavery would typically end after a certain number of years of servitude. Also, most importantly perhaps, slavery was not transmitted from one generation to the next. If you were an African warrior and you were defeated in battle and you were enslaved, your children would not become slaves. Only you were the slave. Even if you were a slave for your entire life, you could still marry, have kids, and your kids would be in a much better situation than you were. So by the start of the 16th century, so we're moving from the 14th century to the 16th century, by the time of the 16th century, the African slave trade has greatly increased. The demand for slaves is rapidly increasing. By the 16th century, almost 200,000 Africans had been transported to Europe and to the Caribbean islands in the Atlantic. This number is going to rapidly increase as the slave trade and slavery in the North American continent kicks off. But at this point, it's primarily being sent to the Caribbean. After the voyages of Columbus, slave traders found another market for slaves, primarily New World plantations. Of course, Columbus and his crew, they're given dominion over parts of the Caribbean. And initially speaking, when the Spanish and the Portuguese come into the Caribbean and they're setting up shop, after they have taken all of the natural resources, after they'd had defeated the native tribes that were there and gotten all of their gold, they still want a way to make money. So they developed the plantation system. The plantation system in the Caribbean is primarily focused around the production of sugarcane. Now, sugarcane is notoriously difficult to produce. It's easy to grow, but it's hard to extract the sugar from it. This was very difficult, back-breaking labor that you couldn't just, you wouldn't have eager Portuguese and Spanish citizens signing up for. So slavery, in this regard, is the natural option. At first, what they tried to do, they tried to enslave the native population. After all, they come in, set up shop. The Native Americans are still there. They're still living in and around the area that these plantations are being built. So the Portuguese and the Spanish, first of all, they tried to enslave the native populations. But this is, as you can imagine, for practical reasons, hard to do. Why? Because if you go in, say you pick the island of, let's say the modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. Okay, the Spanish and the Portuguese, I think it was the Spanish, land there, and they set up these sugarcane plantations. Now, there are Native Americans on this island. So, in order to get slaves, they just go out and take slaves from the Native American population. The practical problem with this is, first of all, by this time, the Native Americans realize what these Europeans are up to. They've already been taken advantage of. They've already been murdered by the Europeans. They realize that the Europeans are only there to make money, that they're not there to live in peace. So the natives already realize the Europeans' intentions behind this. The practical reason is if you go into a local population and take slaves, take them back with you to their plantation, subject them to hard work and hard labor, what's going to happen? You've taken somebody from their home, which is like 5 to 10 miles away. You take them to this plantation, put them at gunpoint and say, work. What's going to happen is that the first chance they get, they're out of there. They're bolting. They're going back to their house. Why? Because they know the island. They know the land. They're from here. They were born here. They were raised here. So if they want to escape, they can escape. And typically speaking, you're not going to find them because you're not from here. They are. They can hide better. So the problem with enslaving Indian populations is the fact that they are never quite able to beat them into subjection because they are fighting this war of attrition on their own homeland. They can easily, and oftentimes they do, run away. Also because the indigenous population was so subjected to, or so vulnerable to European diseases, that oftentimes once these Indian populations were enslaved by the Europeans, and when they were living in close quarters to the Europeans, disease would ravage the population. So it wasn't good for those two reasons. So European colonists found an answer to this labor shortage by importing enslaved workers from Africa. And this enslaved workers from Africa made a better group of slaves for practically due to the reasons I just told you that the Native Americans weren't. These African slaves are being torn away from their home, brought to a new place. So if you're an African slave and you get to a plantation in the middle of the Caribbean, it's not like you can just up and run away. First of all, you don't know the island. Second of all, you're on an island. There's not too many places you can go. It's not like you can escape, board a ship, and sail back to Africa. Right? The Africans, the people that were being enslaved are not sailors. They don't know how to run ships. They don't even know where they're going. Right? Also, it's not a homogeneous group of people that are made slaves. With these local Indian populations, you're taking these slaves from one tribe, from this one place. These people would have spoke the same language, they shared the same culture, so they could communicate and they could devise ways to escape as a group. These African slaves, a lot of times, would have been unable to do this because they're coming from different tribes, they're coming from different cultures, from different geographical places in Africa. So not only could they not speak the same language, which is a huge practical problem, because you can't understand what the other person's saying, but they would share a completely different set of religious and cultural values and all the other stuff that comes from inhabiting or coming from a different culture. So, let's talk about the New World expansion, especially expansion into the English North America. At the end of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal dominated the South American continent, parts of the Caribbean, and as well as Central America. They had also gotten a foothold in parts of North America, as we talked about in our colonization of North America lecture. We have the Spanish in modern-day Texas, as well as modern-day Florida. You also have the French in modern-day Canada. England, however, had colonizing ambitions of its own, and it was eager to gain some sort of economic impact from its North American colonies. The English were looking for a way for their North American colonies to make some money. According to the historian Peter Wood, quote, "For the English in the New World, there are really three labor options." So, the English quickly realized that the only way they're going to make money in their colonies is from agriculture. The problem with agriculture is that you need a labor source. So this is what Peter Wood has to say. There are really only three labor options. One is to transport people from England to the New World, which is what they do initially. Another is to employ or exploit indigenous labor, which is what they try to do. And the third is to bring people from Africa. So initially speaking, the people that are brought over, unlike the French, unlike the Spanish, unlike the Portuguese, the English attempt to settle North America using English citizens. They say, hey, we got these great new economic opportunities for you. A lot of people sign up. A lot of people are eager to come over to North America to try to cut out a living for themselves. But the problem with that is that you can't recruit a whole lot of English colonists to come over here and do back-breaking manual labor for little to no money. If they're coming over here, they're wanting to start their own farm, to start their own fur trapping business, to do something along those lines. They're not wanting to come over here just so they can work for somebody in menial conditions, because they were basically already doing that in England. So the second option was to try to enslave the native population, just like the Spanish tried to do. And just like the Spanish, this doesn't work. But this is an even bigger problem for the English in North America because the size of the native population. There's no way a tiny group of poorly armed colonists could think that they can enslave some of the native peoples that were there. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Well, not literally outgunned, but as far as their military power goes, they wouldn't have been able to stand up to them. So the only logical option for the English colonies is to turn to African slaves. English colonial ambition set the stage for England's first leading settlement in the New World. That settlement is Jamestown. Settlement of Jamestown. In 1607, colonists first landed in Jamestown. By 1609, even more colonists were starting to come. The colony was starting to be successful. However, the first couple of generations of colonists had a really hard time, mainly because it was unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar weather, and also because, again, these colonists are trying to make money, and so no one really thinks about practical concerns, so much so that Jamestown barely survives their first winter. Because when people get there, they're interested in making money, so they go out and try to do some fur trapping. However, they don't think to build up their agriculture supply to actually feed themselves throughout the winter, long-term food production. So there's this struggle to figure out how Jamestown's going to make money. What's going to be their primary source of income? Because you want to be able to recruit people with the goal of those people getting rich somehow. Eventually, what the immigrants to Jamestown realize is that the way the colony is going to survive is by the growing and the selling of tobacco. The English realize that tobacco, it's going to be tobacco that's going to be their cash crop. But all these new tobacco fields that start springing up, of course, require many hands and many labor. At first, the men needed in the fields came from the working classes of England. In exchange for passage to Virginia and to other colonies, these poor English people traded 4 to 7 years of labor. So they're guaranteed free passage under the assumption that they would work for free, basically as indentured servants, as slaves, in these English tobacco fields. However, after their contract is up, they're free to do as they please. And oftentimes what would happen is that these English laborers who would come over and work in the fields for 4 to 7 years, after they were free, since they've been working tobacco for the past 7 years, they would start tobacco farms of their own. They already knew how to do it. They knew the type of work that went into it. So they would start their own tobacco farms. However, the turnover of servants becomes so rapid that these English colonies begin, the original English planters, the people who were trying to make money, begin to start to have competition from the people that they once employed. The guys that were once servants are now becoming successful farmers in their own right. And so this starts to trouble some of the aristocracy in the colonies at the time. So what starts to happen is that instead of hiring indentured servants, they start to look to the native population, begin to exploit the Native Americans. Again, these native workers are, first of all, highly susceptible to English diseases, and also it's hard to capture somebody if you're trying to capture them in their own land. Even if you do succeed in physically capturing them, it's going to be even harder to keep them there because they could easily and quickly run away. The third option soon becomes available. In 1619, a Dutch ship, a Dutch pirate ship that had stolen some Spanish cargo. Part of this cargo were captive Africans. This Dutch ship anchors at Jamestown. The ship needed supplies, so in exchange for these supplies, they trade their cargo of slaves, of African slaves. The English who had settled in Jamestown and over the rest of the 17th century in order to bring British North American colonies soon reached a turning point. The turning point revolved around this problem of labor, of exactly who they were going to hire, because the goal is to make as much money as possible. So how do we do this? What sort of labor supply are we going to draw from? Would they continue to hire Europeans and Africans as indentured servants? Or would they rely on Africans as enslaved workers for life, the model that had been developed in the Caribbean? So would they continue to use indentured servants who would be free after a 4 to 7 year contract, or would they follow this new model? The new model that was developing by the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Caribbean. Remember, the slave trade has already been in effect for quite some time now. The Spanish in the Caribbean and these sugarcane plantations quickly realized that it was a more economically viable model to simply enslave these Africans for life, to buy them as slaves and then to refuse to let them to go free. That it created a more stable source of labor. And so this is the model that the English adopt, beginning in Jamestown in the colony of Virginia. And this is also the beginning of racial slavery. We sometimes imagine that such oppressive laws were quickly put into action by force and the greed of the landowners, that one day the colonists wake up and say, hey, I got a great idea, let's make these Africans our lifelong slaves. But that's not the way that slavery is developed in North America. It happened gradually, one person at a time, one law at a time, even one colony at a time. One of the places that we have a clear view of this terrible transformation is in the colony of Virginia. In the early years of the colony, many Africans and many poor whites, most of the laborers came from the English working class, stood on the same ground. So initially speaking, even the slaves that were brought over from Africa originally were eventually released out of slavery, like they had always done. Black and white women worked side by side, oftentimes in the fields. Black and white men who broke their service contracts were equally punished. So initially speaking, in North America, you have the enslavement of both Europeans and Africans who would oftentimes work side by side in the same sort of conditions. All of these were indentured servants. During their time as servants, they were fed and housed. Afterward, they would be given their freedom dues. This was like a small lump sum of money that was given to them after they had worked off their time. This comes from the fact that, traditionally speaking, the English believed that they had the right to enslave non-Christians or a captive taken in a just war. Traditionally speaking, in Europe, you were not allowed to enslave Christians. So instead, what the Europeans would do is they would turn to other European populations, or oftentimes non-European populations. Mainly, for most of European history, these populations came from Eastern Europe. You've heard of the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. The name Slavic, the origins of the word Slavic, is the same as the word, our English word, slave, because the Slavic people, initially speaking, were non-Christians who the Europeans, it was okay for them to enslave after war. However, African and Indians might also fit into one or both of these categories. African Americans at this time were oftentimes Christians. Indians were oftentimes Christians. But what if they learned English and converted to the Protestant church? This was a problem because a lot of Africans and Indians do this. Should they be released from bondage and given their freedom dues? What if, on the other hand, states determined not by religious faith, but by skin color? So the problem was solved by basing slavery not upon a person's religious beliefs, because religious beliefs can be changed. Right? If I'm an African brought over from Africa to North America where the predominant religion is Christianity, it's reasonable to assume that I could have a fateful conversion, that I can convert not simply because I'm afraid, but because Christianity somehow appeals to me. This has happened. Oftentimes this did happen. So religion can change. So there is a need then to base slavery not upon something that's changeable, but upon something that can't be changed, i.e. a person's skin color. African slaves are distinguished by their skin color. They're easy to spot out. Okay, that person's African. That person's African. Therefore, they must be slaves. You can't pick out somebody's religion just by looking at them. But you can pick out somebody's skin color. So, the need arised from these, what were once indentured servants, began to challenge the elite. So there was a need to find a replacement for indentured servitude, a need to find a classification for slaves other than religious beliefs. And all of this leads to the racial-based slavery in North America. As the historian David Bright explains, this disorder that the indentured servant system had created made racial slavery to Southern slaveholders much more attractive. Because what were black slaves now? Well, they were permanent, dependent labor force who could be defined as a people set apart. They are racially set apart. They were outsiders. They were strangers, and in many ways throughout the world, slavery has taken root, especially where people are considered outsiders and can be put in a permanent status of slavery. So slavery is effective when you can visually and easily distinguish somebody as a slave, where you can make that person become the other. And you can justify this somehow. And so you start to see these justifications crop up. And these justifications come in many forms. They come in a sense of religious justification. That African Americans bore the mark of Cain. In the story of Cain and Abel, after Cain kills his brother Abel, God puts a curse upon Cain. A curse in the form of some form of physical mark. So some preachers began to say this physical mark is black skin. And so that the African Americans are somehow cursed by God, and this somehow creates a justifiable reason as to why they ought to be slaves. Also, you have several passages throughout both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament that tell slaves to be comfortable in the position that they're in. That tell slaves that they ought to obey their masters. Slaves, obey your masters, says Paul in the New Testament. So guess what the Sunday morning sermons were on? Slaves, obey your master. So you have a religious justification. You also start to see biological justifications. The biological justification evolves over time. With the introduction of Darwinian evolution and the introduction of biology as a science, you have biological justification along the lines that these recently imported Africans are somehow dumber than Europeans, are somehow more primitive, or of a different species than Europeans. So these justifications take several lines, but most of it centers on and around the skin color, what makes them easily distinguishable as slaves. All right, so let's talk about the Atlantic slave trade in general. So again, the Atlantic slave trade begins in West Africa. Most of the slave trade is going to be centered on the Caribbean or the North America as far as where the slaves are being brought to. Human cargo was transported across the Atlantic Ocean and sold to the New World slave owners who brought slaves to work primarily for agricultural reasons, to work the crops. European slave traders such as Nicholas Owen waited at these ports for slaves. African slave traders transported slaves from the interior of Africa to the exterior, where they were then boarded on ships and then taken to the New World. The economic impact of the slave trade on the African continent was devastating. African merchants, the poor, African royalty, anyone who could be abducted in these raids were abducted. It didn't matter what your social standing, who you were in the community. If a slave raid came about in your village, you were subject to becoming a slave. They were taken without question. African life, African culture, and traditions were torn asunder. Families were ripped apart. Especially young men were abducted. Guns were introduced, and slave raids and even wars increased. So you have slave traders who go into communities for the sole purpose of kidnapping and abducting people. And on the African psyche, this had a tremendous impact. The culture was deeply affected. After kidnapping potential slaves, merchants often forced them in these sort of forced marches to walk all the way to the ports, where they would then be shackled, cuffed, placed aboard these ships in tightly packed spaces as possible, and then shipped overseas, what was become known as the Middle Passage. During the Middle Passage, they were often denied food and water for extended periods of time. Many people died during the Middle Passage due to the conditions. Once they reached the Caribbean or the Americas, they were sold off during auctioning blocks to whoever bid on them. So slavery would become a highly profitable system for white plantation owners, especially in the colonial South. Already during the beginning of American history, we start to see an economic divide between the American North and the American South. Why? Because the most profitable business to get into, as far as the South is concerned, are these plantations. Is the production of cash crops, such as tobacco, but we eventually see a shift in the South, especially to sugar, rice, and most importantly, cotton. The American South becomes one of the world's leading cotton producers, and cotton becomes a very valuable crop. So slavery was becoming rapidly entrenched in American society. Not only American society, but also American politics. These wealthy plantation owners weren't just plantation owners, but they were also deeply involved in the American political system. So they were deeply involved in not only making money off of slavery, but also institutionally speaking, making sure that slavery got some sort of political protection. So they often developed laws to keep African American populations under control. Not only legal laws, but also a cultural system of brutality, to the point that plantation owners could not be legally punished for how they treated their slaves if they gave some sort of vague, justifiable reason. So what this resulted in is a culture of oppression in which slaves were physically beat for whatever reason, no matter if the reason was justifiable or not. Slaves were refused education. It was oftentimes illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. If you were a white person who got caught teaching slaves how to read and write, you could face imprisonment. Oftentimes, slaves weren't allowed to have families. Oftentimes, slaves weren't allowed to have their own churches. Slaves weren't allowed to be ministers. There's good reason for this. Two early slave rebellions that take place in the South are led by African ministers. So you have this culture of oppression that happens because the Southern economy, the Southern way of life, is built upon slavery. So if they lose that slavery, the Southern economy and the Southern culture would therefore collapse. Georgia was the last colony to legalize slavery in 1750. And after Georgia legalizes slavery, slavery becomes legal in all 13 colonies. The history of slavery, once it is fully legalized, becomes a highly contentious one. Not everyone wants slavery legal. Not everyone is okay with this culture of oppression that develops in America. You're always going to have those who dissent. Typically, religious people who oppose slavery on ethical grounds. You're always going to have these anti-abolitionists who are constantly politically and religiously protesting against slavery. But slavery is now entrenched into American society and especially into the American economy. As new states are created in American history, once we have the Louisiana Purchase and America begins to expand westward, this issue of slavery is going to again come to the forefront of American political debates. Should these newly formed territories be slave states? The southern states are going to argue yes, because these southern plantation owners want to extend their plantations into these new states and want to continue to make slavery a viable economic option because they want to continue to maintain their level of wealth and power that they have in the southern states. Opposition to slavery is going to slowly grow, especially moral opposition to slavery. All of this is going to culminate in the 19th century America when we have the battle over slavery in the form of the Civil War. The Civil War is going to be fought primarily due to the institution of slavery and due to the implications, the social, cultural implications of slavery. And so we'll get to that more. We'll pick up that once we start talking about the Civil War. Thank you for listening to this video. I hope you'll tune in again to when we talk about the second American institution of American religion. Until then, have a good one.